So I'm Princess Foster, as many of you know, the moderator for this evening and the support group chair and facilitator. My job is to create a self-welcoming and supportive environment where we can share, learn, and connect so we can adapt and cope with our ocular inflammatory diseases. Tonight's support group is Ocular Inflammatory Disease Research Updates and Emerging Therapies. We have guest speaker Dr. Raj Shah and Will Thorley, our research coordinator. Before we get started, I'll just go over a few housekeeping things. So our support group is under the Ocular Immunology and Uveitis Foundation, a 501c3 not-for-profit tax-exempt organization founded in 2005 by Dr. C. Stephen Foster. Our mission is to find cures for ocular inflammatory diseases, correct the worldwide deficit of properly trained ocular immunologists, and provide education and emotional support for patients, their loved ones, friends afflicted with ocular inflammatory disease. We have some upcoming fundraising events. We have the Boston Walk, which will be Sunday, August 23rd in Boston at the Hyatt Regency. Walk around the Charles River. The New York, New Jersey Walk will be in Verona Park in Verona, New Jersey, and that will be September 19th. We have our annual educational course, which we call the Crash Course. This year it will be October 24th and 25th in Newport Beach. Patients are welcome to join as well as physicians, and we have support group associated with that as well. We also have a celebration this year, Frontiers of Discovery, and that will be Friday or Saturday, November 13 or 14, at the Harvard Club in Boston, Massachusetts. Our next support group is June 9th. That's Ask an Ocular Immunologist, Secondary Complications of Ocular Inflammatory Disease, with Dr. Chang and Dr. Anisi. Will be doing dry eye and uveitis on our July 1st support group. Before we get started, I always like to go over our ground rules. We are a self-help group. We share stories or experiences to help each other cope and live better with a chronic eye inflammatory disease. Our ground rules are that we focus the discussion on the present. We help each other move forward in a positive way while living with our chronic illness. We don't offer medical advice unless we have a license to do so, nor do we ask that of our guest speakers. No criticism of healthcare providers or past negative healthcare experiences. Remember, we're focused here on moving forward. Please stay muted until it's your turn to speak. And if we're Zoom bombed, please leave the meeting and rejoin. Tonight, we have the privilege of having Dr. Raj Shah here. He is an assistant professor of ophthalmology at Wake Forest University of Medicine in North Carolina, where he specializes in uveitis, ocular inflammatory diseases, and retina. He graduated from Duke University for his undergrad, went on to University of Texas Southwestern for his medical school, graduating in 2005. He completed his residency at State University of New York, and then we had the privilege of having Dr. Shah do a uveitis and ocular immunology fellowship with Dr. Foster at Mercy and under the foundation. He then followed with a vitreoretinal surgery fellowship, and Dr. Shah is now on the board of the foundation. Before we have Dr. Shah speak about ocular inflammatory disease research updates and emerging therapies, I'd like to turn it over to Will Thorley, who will speak about what it's like for a patient to be in a study. I'll stop sharing my screen. Will is a research coordinator with us, and I'll turn it over to you, Will.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Yes, as Francis said, my name is Will, and I'm a research coordinator. I've been a research coordinator for the last year or so, and I've gotten the privilege and the honor to work directly with patients with uveitis and learn a little bit about what it is like in a trial for them. So I just wanted to talk briefly about three different things, just to kind of give you a primer on what clinical trials are before Dr. Shah speaks. So the first thing is just a little bit of an overview of what a clinical trial is. Secondly, how to get enrolled in a clinical trial, and then lastly, what to expect if you take place or take part in a clinical trial. So briefly, just an overview. If you're not familiar, a clinical trial is a research study where any potential treatment is being explored. So it could be a new medication or it could be a device of some kind. But the key thing is that it's just a treatment that is being explored by an organization. And multiple different types of organizations can put these on, such as pharmaceutical companies, could be a university, it could be a government agency. And so basically, we just have a research study that's being organized by an organization. So the ones that I have worked with primarily in my time as a research coordinator have been pharmaceutical companies. And these companies work directly with our clinics to help recruit participants to undergo treatments, typically with some sort of drug for uveitis. And one thing that you may see when you're looking at clinical trials is you may see phases, like it'll say phase one, phase two, or phase three. And I just kind of wanted to tell you what those are briefly. So phase one, if a trial's in phase one, that's sort of the very beginning of examining this drug in human treatment. And so at the very beginning, they're just examining safety. We're not worried about if the drug works yet or not. We just want to make sure it's safe for people to use. If you see phase two, that means that they're examining both the safety and the efficacy of a certain drug, typically in a small population. And then if you see phase three, that means that has moved on from phases one and two, and now they are examining the efficacy, how well it's working across a larger population, while continuing to make sure that everybody is staying safe in this trial. They are maintaining the safety throughout the course of the trial as well. If you look at these trials, you may also notice that there are some participants who receive the drug and some participants who do not actually receive the drug. They may receive a pill that does not do anything or a treatment that does not do anything, and that is called a placebo. And typically, it is a random chance of participants receiving either the actual medication or the placebo. And this is done so that they can see if the drug actually provided a benefit for the participants. So uh, just know that if you were to take place in a trial, there is a definite possibility that you could be receiving a placebo as well. So that is a real possibility in clinical trials. So that's just kind of a brief overview of what they are and a little bit about how they work. So now I want to talk a little bit about how you might enroll in a trial and how to determine whether you're eligible for a trial. So I would say don't be afraid to ask your physician, ask your ophthalmologist if you think that you might meet the criteria for a certain trial. We also provide a lot of details on our website, uveitis.org, about our current trials that we have going on. And so definitely don't be afraid to look through those. And if you feel that you might be a good match for a trial, and feel free to reach out to us. And from that point on, your ophthalmologist will determine and look through your chart and determine does your current condition fit into this trial. Now, some of the trials can have very specific criteria. So it's certainly nobody's fault if they are not able to be part of a trial. It is not a personal failing by any means. It's just they have very specific criteria sometimes. And so just know also that even if you have an interest in a trial, you may not be accepted just purely based on their guidelines. And then lastly, before joining a trial, you'll be informed about everything within the trial, everything that is going to happen, including all the possible benefits and the risks as well. And that is called informed consent. So there will be a consent form that explains all of those aspects of the trial, and your physician will make sure that you understand every aspect of it before agreeing to participate. And then I just want to speak briefly on like what a day-to-day sort of visit might look like if you are participating in a trial. So at the very beginning, you'll be given sort of a schedule, and trials can last varying lengths of time. Sometimes they can be very short, like 8 or 12 weeks, and then sometimes they can go up to 2 or 3 years even. And so you could be at any point, if you wish to leave the trial, you are free to do so also. There is no solid commitment to spending 2 to 3 years on a medication that you don't enjoy being on, that you don't want to be on. So just to have that caveat in there as well. But so the trials can have varying lengths, and at the very beginning of your participation, you'll be given a schedule that clearly lays out what's going to happen at every single visit, so that there'll be no surprises. You'll know exactly what's going to happen when you walk into the clinic that day. Um, and you also will notice if you look at this schedule that you'll receive the standard sort of testing that you might get every time you come into the ophthalmologist, such as taking your vital signs. They'll look at your eyes through the microscope. Um, they may do blood testing, but within these trials, there may be additional testing as well. Things like getting an EKG done, things like completing extra questionnaires. And so these may also cause the visit to run a little bit longer than your standard ophthalmology visit. Typically, in my experience, I've seen visits go from 2 to 4 hours, depending on how many sort of additional tests this study might require. And in general, the benefits to you are that you receive treatment at no cost. And in addition to that, you actually will usually receive a stipend of some kind. In recent trials that I've seen, it's been anywhere from $100 to $200 per visit. And so if you're coming in for 10 or 15 visits, that will stack up, and that will be a good benefit to you as compensation for your time and effort in participating in the trial. And also in our trials currently, the meals and travel expenses are also covered on the day of your visit as well. So there is a definite benefit in that regard as well to participating in a clinical trial. So that's just what I've seen in my experience. Feel free to answer or to ask me any questions that you might have. I'm happy to answer as best as I can. So, and then I just want to finish by saying that if you'd like to get more information on trials and sort of browse them, feel free to go to clinicaltrials.gov. That is a great resource for any and all clinical trials that are currently active in the United States. And also on uveitis.org on our website, we'll have all of the active clinical trials that are being performed at our sites. So, and that's all I have. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you, Will. We'll hold questions for the end after Dr. Shah speaks, but you can post in the chat questions, or you can ask, just raise your hand and we'll unmute and ask questions. So we will do that after Dr. Shah speaks. So now I'd like to turn over the screen to Dr. Shah to speak about emerging therapies and research in ocular inflammatory disease.
Wow. Well, thank you, Francis, for organizing this. Will, thank you for that great introduction about clinical trials. And feel free. I know everyone comes from a different set of experiences. Some of you really want to dive into the nitty-gritty of the latest and greatest trials, and we're happy to talk about that. But I'm also happy to talk about if this is your first foray into emerging therapies and clinical trials, happy to try to break it down so just to give you a better understanding. And I think the nice thing about Will's is at Mercy, which I think really is the pinnacle of clinical excellence, both in care, but also in clinical research. And I'm the director of clinical trials here at Wake Forest in North Carolina, in the western part of North Carolina. And I'm still trying to emulate, I think, the model that they have and the throughput. My clinical trial unit is much more humble. We get a handful of trials. But it's an exciting, aspect of what we do as clinicians. I would say see clinical trials not just as a thing you have to do. It's not something that we expect you to do as clinicians. It is another tool for your care. And, I think the biggest thing I think that some patients are really hung up on is they see clinical trials as experimentation, and it's not. I think it is, it depends on what stage of and type of clinical trial. There are some that are just information gathering, where it's like a retrospective, trying to gather aspects about your medical history for a very rare disease. Some are interventional, and for some, like Will was talking about, there are early stages, there are more late stages. There are some drugs which are approved for things like arthritis that they're going to start to look at for diseases that are rare, like uveitis. So I don't think that you should always look at it as a bad thing. Some it's just trying to expand indications of a well vetted drug. So, for example, Humira was well into its dominance in the world of biologics. And for those that are unfamiliar, Humira is a anti-TNF alpha subcutaneous injection. It has ruled arthritis since the 90s, and it wasn't until the 2000s that it was looked at for uveitis. So when that went into a phase 3 clinical trial, it really was a drug that was well known to the public, and we just didn't have access to it for the world of uveitis. And so thankfully, AbbVie sponsored a trial. It was actually really a brave step for them because they were going after a very rare indication. And so it really wasn't a mystery for us as clinicians. We actually had it was on our wish list of drugs that we loved to use for uveitis, and they finally did the trial, and it took a while to get those results together, but it really has been a real windfall for our field. So not every clinical trial is venturing into this world of the unknown. Some of it is very well vetted drugs that we're just trying to get on board for uveitis, which is a great way to advance care. So I know from my last support group there's always a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to keep this overview of emerging therapy a little brief because I want to hear from you guys and I want this to really be interactive. Um, so I know that a lot of you have seen uveitis specialists and are plugged into the OIUF support group. If I had to, give it maybe 10 to 15 minutes on sort of where are we going for uveitis, I'll be honest with you, it's exciting. I think the future is bright. And I think part of that is there's a lot of things you may have heard in the media. The biggest thing for the US market is that the FDA is changing their process for approval. And in the past, the standard way that a drug got approved for use in patients in a post phase 3 world was they had two phase 3 trials that showed that the drug worked against usually placebo or against a standard of care, depending upon what disease state we're talking about. And that was expensive. That was long. When we're talking about studies of rare diseases, there are a lot of pitfalls in trying to get a trial completely enrolled and then get the results to hopefully meet that metric of success for the FDA. And in recent times, the decision has now been made that it's going to be only one pivotal phase 3 trial. So it's going to really change the mix. And I think the future will actually hold a lot more therapeutic options for our humble space that doesn't get the same attention as arthritis and some of the other big inflammatory disease states. So I think we're going to have more options. In other sort of avenues, there's this rare disease pathway, which is a slightly different pathway for getting drugs approved for the market. And that gets used a lot in the uveitis world is that so-called orphan pathway. And the nice thing is that for rare diseases such as uveitis or ocular inflammatory disease, it allows us to get reasonable, high quality clinical data to show that a drug or approach works, but it's not quite as arduous as a traditional phase 3 for like something like heart disease, which requires like thousands of patients, which would take almost a decade in the world of uveitis and ocular inflammatory disease to enroll. So I do think the future is bright. I think we're gonna get more and more drugs that will hopefully make it to the finish line and get approved by the FDA. And so there'll be more options for us as clinicians. Because unfortunately for right now, there's not very many FDA approved drugs for the disease states that we deal with. For uveitis, it's just Humira, it's just Acthar corticotropin, and that's it. There was the Retisert implant for uveitis, but unfortunately, as of April 30th, that is no longer an option. There is intravitreal injections of steroid. And for those of you who are very familiar with the Stephen Foster paradigm, which I'm very much a disciple of, is that you really want to look past steroids only because steroids are part of the equation, but having more drugs beyond steroids really is what's I think going to prevent patients from going blind from their ocular inflammatory disease. So aside from that, I think other big emerging trends in therapy is this idea of biosimilars. So you guys may have heard of biosimilars. You may be on Humira and have been forced to change to a biosimilar. But ultimately, I'd say biosimilars have been a good thing for uveitis and ocular inflammatory disease. For the longest time, we've had these really benchmark drugs like Remicade, like rituximab, that have been only on label and very difficult to get off label. I think Francis really has the master class of how to get patients off label therapy, for really blinding diseases. But the good news is when the patents ran out on these benchmark drugs, the biosimilar world came into effect. Rituximab and Remicade have been getting these so-called generic versions, and most of them are pretty good. There are a few that don't perform as well as the reference drug. And then Humira has been an explosion over the last year and a half into the biosimilar space. And what that has meant is that I think it's actually the path for patients to get on drug have been a lot easier because there's been more options. And insurance companies are always looking to save money. And so the nice thing is that they will broker deals with certain biosimilars. And it's actually been easier to get patients on biosimilars. And for the drug of Humira, there's been more options, and they've worked as well as the reference drug, adalimumab. So I do think it's actually opening the avenues for therapies. There's, a particular drug named Actemra or tocilizumab, which is anti-IL-6, which is an exciting class of medication for the world of uveitis. Before, it was so difficult to get patients off-label exceptions. Tocilizumab is only approved for arthritis, for JIA, and also giant cell arteritis. To get it for uveitis has been a very challenging battle, but thankfully, because it's now off patent, we're getting more and more biosimilars, and we're starting to see infusions become more of a possibility for patients with uveitis for anti-IL-6. So I think that's exciting as well. And so aside from the biosimilar world, there's always new and emerging therapies. So in particular, the invited are many, but the substantial ones that we really focus on are few. TNF alpha has been a winning group of drugs for uveitis and ocular inflammatory disease. Targeting of CD20 in rituximab has been a winning strategy. IL-6, I think, will be more of a winning strategy. There is a new drug that's in development for injection in the eye from Genentech that's anti-IL-6. And I think that's going to be a game changer for patients with uveitic macular edema. And then there's other biologics coming down the pipeline. But to be honest with you, classes like IL-1 haven't turned out to be a big effect for most of us in the world of uveitis and ocular inflammatory disease. IL-17, we can honestly say at this point, I don't think has been a big player for uveitis and ocular inflammatory disease. But there's this whole other class, anti-IL-23, which is approved for psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. We remain hopeful that this class may one day get looked at for the world of uveitis, but that data is still forthcoming. So beyond novel biologics, there is the idea of cell-based therapy. Cell-based therapy is very upfield, where basically you guys may have heard of cell-based therapy in the world of cancer, where basically we take someone's blood, we segment out and look for immune cells, specifically in that scenario to fight cancer, and then we engineer them, we hype them up, and we infuse them back into the patient. And it's been really a game changer for cancer therapy. And you see a lot of these big pharma companies looking into cell-based therapy. It's incredibly expensive. It's like multiple millions of dollars. It's at least $1 million per infusion. It might be multiple millions of dollars, depending on the disease state. But it's actually getting looked at for inflammatory disease. In the world of inflammatory disease, these cell-based therapies have been looked at for lupus. There is a phase 1/2 trial looking at it for uveitis. So I'm very excited by it because essentially it's trying to re-engineer the immune system at its most, I think, elegant point, which is the T cells, and particularly the Treg cells. And truly, if we master this, this will be the holy grail or cure for ocular inflammatory disease and for uveitis. It'll be expensive. These therapies aren't quick to manufacture because they have to be tailored to each patient. But it's an exploding and emerging market that truly, I think, holds a lot of hope for the world of patients suffering for ocular inflammatory disease. The final group that I wanted to touch on are these oral novel small molecule inhibitors. And one group is what's known as the JAK inhibitors. The JAK inhibitors have been an explosive group for the world of uveitis, for the world of, arthritis and systemic inflammation. They've been approved for arthritis. They've been approved for inflammatory bowel disease. And we had looked at it with an earlier drug, filgotinib, for uveitis. Unfortunately, the company decided to stop development because of, I think, hurdles for bringing their specific drug to market. But there is this exciting company named Priovant, and they've just finished, they've completed a phase 3 trial for an oral JAK inhibitor. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with a JAK inhibitor, it's looking, we have the biologics, which attack the cell surface receptors and create a bunch of signaling that leads to inflammatory pathways. But inside the cell, there's a whole signal mechanism that these receptors that the biologics are really acting on are working to create action. And the JAK pathway has been an intriguing pathway for a long time. And there's multiple different forms of JAKs. There's JAK1, JAK2, JAK3. And the long and the short is whatever spread of what JAK kinase you decide to target really creates your efficacy. But it also, in creating the efficacy, creates also side effects. And so then there's this complementary pathway called the TIC pathway. And the Priovant product in particular is a TIC inhibitor and a JAK inhibitor. And so it's that combination which might be a sweet spot to really work on efficacy, but also have hopefully a favorable side effect profile. And so I was involved in the phase 2 trial for Priovant and it was very promising. It was a very small trial. The Clarity trial, like I said, is finished enrollment. We expect a readout in this next year. So another big thing I think that may come our way and is a very promising thing for uveitis patients. I don't think we talked about topical local therapies. Aside from the uveitic macadamia injection for Genentech, there is a topical drop out of Israel that's a completely non-steroid based mechanism. It's called TRS 001 is the drug name. And it's finished its phase 3 for anterior uveitis, and it was very promising data where we were able to control the inflammation without raising pressure. It's interesting because it works via a completely different pathway. We've always focused immunology wise on B cell antibody mediated disease and the T cell type mechanisms, and then the cytokines with biologics. But this is actually working on the macrophage system, which is a part of the innate immune system, but it's becoming a bigger recognized player in a lot of immunologic dysregulation with uveitis. And so the fact that the Tarsier drug works through macrophages is actually very interesting. And they're looking at it not just for topical therapy, they eventually will develop it for posterior segment injectable use. But I think the science behind it is the start of a great new journey for working on the immune system that hopefully will pay a lot of dividends for many diseases. The final thing I want to touch on is gene therapy, which I think many of you have heard of. I'm a retina specialist, as you guys heard. There's a lot of interest in the so-called biofactory approach, where we essentially deliver a blueprint into the eyeball, and the eyeball starts to make the drug of choice. So in the scenario of retina, one of the big drugs we like to use is something that targets something called VEGF. And there's been a lot of phase 3 data, which will start to read out this next year, either an injection or a surgery where we do gene delivery to the eye and have the eye produce this anti-VEGF molecule. There's two different competing platforms, and we'll see how the data looks probably in the next 6 months. And I think that will be a prototype for a lot of rare diseases where we may start to produce some of these drugs, like TNF alpha in particular, in the eye for treatment of uveitis and blinding conditions. So I kind of gave you a whirlwind there, and I want to give us plenty of time to discuss questions from everybody here. So I'm going to stop and ask for questions about emerging therapies or questions you have about uveitis.